Chag HaSukkot is 4.5 months away. So we'll start with Chag HaSukkot.
Good idea.
Now, on Chag HaSukkot, everybody knows, we have a lulav and an esrog.
Right.
And that's part of the mitzvah to be performed on Sukkot. Now, in the Gemara, they were struggling with the problem. One of the problems they had was to determine what exactly a lulav was. Okay? They didn't know which plant it was. And so they had this question in the Gemara about what a lulav is. And they have, as traditional, they have different opinions and viewpoints. And somebody comes up with a reason. And his reason was that all Hashem's ways are darchei noam, are pleasant. Therefore, the plant that they were discussing was a plant that if you held it in your hand and you shook it, you would have bleeding on your hand because it had thorns and roughage on the place where you hold it. So this guy brings a pasuk and he says, that's my argument. No reason, no exposition. He brings a pasuk, he says, God's ways, Hashem's ways are darchei noam, are ways of pleasantness. Therefore, to have a mitzvah and then go away with a bloody hand was not compatible with the pasuk.
Right.
When I heard that at a shir, I flipped out. Because what did I do? I generalized that point to say the following, that everything in Torah that relates to the understanding, to the feelings, to the action, but especially to the understanding, the frame that I was in, must be exemplary of the darchei noam principle. In other words, Hashem won't give unknowables, paradox that can't be solved, where the mind is left up in the air. There's closure on each of the topics, could be incomplete, could be missing things, but there's relative closure on different things so that the mind is in a pleasant state. The mind is in an unpleasant state when it's fed too much belief without evidence for truth, and so the mind regurgitates. It's not in the pleasant mode. So yours truly generalized, I should say, this principle, and it became the fundamental orientation, and indeed it's the name of all the work that I do in Torah. All my Torah writings are called darchei noam, from this story. Okay. Now, one of the things that struck me was that I always had difficulty with the text, the Chumash biblical Torat Moshe text, with these names of Hashem and Elohim, the two primary names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I don't know, one day it hit me so strong that my mind isn't at rest. I was very up in the air how to explain why one piece, one chapter or one section is Elohim, another section is Hashem, some sections are both. It switches from Hashem to Elohim or vice versa, and some sections have neither. Like in the story of Yosef, the first chapter 38 or whatever the first chapter is, in the Yosef story, it's a whole parak, and there's neither. So again, it didn't follow the pattern. So I took upon myself to try to study this and try to understand what this is all about. As time went on, I realized, when I looked at the Meforshim, that everybody says something about Hashem and Elohim. The famous Chazal that everybody knows is that Hashem is Rachmim and Elohim is Din. And then they go on. But it was nobody, none of the Meforshim, who took the time to discuss or answer every question, every place where it says Hashem and every place where it says Elohim to say something that answers the question, why, and not the other way. Now, it's not taking it for granted. Everybody took it for granted. It gave you pshat about din and rachmim, but nobody took the trouble to comment on each one. Now, in the text, there's about 1,800 places in the Chumash. Not Nach. In the Chumash, there's 1,800 places or so where it says Hashem, and about 250 places where it says Elohim. Okay, it also says Elohim Acherim, but when you look at a general ballpark figure, it's 250 places. So, I embarked on a project to do what nobody did. It was left little things for little guys. And where do I come off to make a perush? What am I going to do? I'm going to duplicate Rashi. I'm going to duplicate the Malvim. My knowledge of the Gemara and Chazal and Agaritas was not enough to imitate Rashi and bring in Midrash and so on. So, but it was left for a little guy, a big guy with a little guy. What am I going to tell you? So what turned out was this understanding of each one of the entries. So on each one of the 1,800 places where it says Hashem, even it says Vaydaber Hashem El Moshe, which is a standard refrain in the text, or Vayomer, but most of the time Vaydaber. And there's a whole discussion of Vaydaber and Vayomer and all the meaning, what that was all about, because that's another one that hit me so strong. Sometimes it's Vayomer Hashem, and sometimes it's Vaydaber Hashem. And then it switches. 2 psukim later, it goes back. So these switches related to the names intrigued me, and I began to work on that topic. Okay. But, being me, I was familiar with the documentary hypothesis, which we'll talk about tonight, in terms of the unity of the text. In other words, there was a standard opinion in the biblical scholarship world for 150 years that there were different sources that eventually made up the Chumash text, and they were labeled, or they were differentiated, shall we say, by the use of the term Hashem or Elohim, or Hashem Elohim, and no, there were four versions, and each one had in it, was defined by the presence of Hashem and vice versa. Okay. Well, when I looked at what I did and what they did, they're making a lot of fudge. I'm explaining in conceptual terms why it says Hashem and why it says Elohim. Not on language, but on concept. The explanation was in terms of a rational picture. You can disagree, but that's what I did. Whereas here we're having the Chacham Yisrael tradition, the biblical tradition, which is building not on reason, but on authoritative pieces. I mean, here was an authoritative piece that it came down somehow to whoever redacted it, Ezra or whatever you want to say. But the point was, these things had reasonable veracity. They weren't making things up out of the clouds. But when I looked at it, I began to realize that I got something great. And when I first wrote this whole orientation in the beginning, it's 15, 20 years ago, and I realized, wait a minute, I got the first rational refutation of the biblical people. In other words, there was no rational refutation. We as Torah people put an emphasis on Chumash, on Psukim, and Torah Shabbat, and so on. It's essential, it's intrinsic to our whole understanding of Torah. So, we didn't know what to say. We said, look, we don't buy that. We don't believe that. Our belief in Torah is a principle of Matan Torah. It has a fullness. It has Torah Shabbat Peh. Then we can talk about what was given exactly. But this was our conception. What we called the text, or what you guys called ancient Near Eastern text, ANET, was a text. But for us, it's Torah Shabbat, and it's a different concept and requires explanation, which I did in other places. But I saw right away that there was fudge. Now, one of the examples, I'm not going to read the documentary hypothesis, but there were four basic documents. To give you a poignant example is the following. There was one document that had in it Hashem Elokim, the two-part together. Okay? There was one that was a priestly code that had Elokim. So they had different definitions in terms of these names. And somebody noticed or had a piece that was Hashem Elokim. Now, Hashem Elokim only appears, never mind my pshat, what that means. We talked about that before, we'll talk about it again some other time. But the point was that this piece, these two names, and this piece of text that came down is only in the Gan Eden story. Hashem Elokim, not Hashem Elokeinu. Hashem Elokim, the two names together, only appears in chapter 2 and 3 in the Gan Eden story. In between, sandwiched in between the Breshit story, Maseh Breshit, which is an Elokim story, and the Cain story, which is an Hashem story. The first pasuk is Kaniti Ish et Hashem. Okay, so we talked about that and get how I understand that. I'm not talking about that tonight. But wait a minute. 1 minute. When I said before they make fudge, they fill in things that are irrational or make so improbable sense. So there happens to be one exception to Hashem Elokim. In Shmot 9:30, in the Makod, we talked about it once before, in the Makod of Barad, it says over there, Hashem Elokim. Now what does that mean according to these guys? That means they give them the benefit of the doubt. They saw that it only exists. I'm giving the benefit of the doubt. I have a machine that you press a button and it tells you right away it's there, it's not there. I mean, I have a tool that they didn't have, so I'm giving the benefit of the doubt. Because sometimes in the early years when I talked to people, they said, what? What? Really? I never knew that. It was like a big chiddush that Hashem Elokim is only in the Gan Eden story. Mm-hmm. So that it was a given, and the given, you didn't examine it. So it added like kind of a myth to it. All of a sudden it was all over the place. Of course they were talking about Hashem Elokeinu. There's 155 places in Dvarim alone in Moshe's speech, which is Hashem Elokeinu in the second person. But I didn't say that. I said Hashem Elokim, not Hashem Elokeinu. So that's a big analysis, some of which we did before. We'll do it again other times in different ways. But the point tonight is, what does that mean? That means that they took that document, okay, and for some reason it got hooked on to this pasuk in 9:30. One pasuk. What was going on? How did they do such a thing? What do they have to do? They have to cut and paste, like it says on your computer machine. They in effect cut and paste and filled in gaps where it shouldn't have been, or it should have continued with this, let's say, Elokim story in their term, and then all of a sudden it says Hashem, and they didn't know what to do. So they said, well, somehow this got in and the story stopped. So the first piece of the story, 3 psukim, is Elokim, one document. Then the next part is Hashem, and it goes 6 psukim, 10 psukim. Well, that's the Hashem document. And so, in one piece, one chapter of a story, whatever, you have 4 or 5 cuttings and pastings. Now, it's not impossible, but it's to me very, very unreasonable. So the basic result of this, why did I start with Dachinoam? Because that started the whole trend, which eventually led to the breakthrough and to the understanding of the system and so on and so on. But the basic point was, there was a basic refutation of the documentary hypothesis. Now, Cassuto also wrote and made a analysis and a critique of the documentary hypothesis. At the time he wrote it, I think it was in the 30s or early, maybe 20s. At the time he wrote it, it made a little bit of an impact. But the history of biblical scholarship has rolled it completely. I read it. He has some points that I differ with and so on, but it wasn't a refutation of this. He dealt with the notions of sevens and whatever. He had a different methodology, and he wrote the piece, and it's a thin book, and you can read it. It was translated, but you can read Documentary Hypothesis, and okay. But I didn't spend the time. I wrote a piece on Kasuda, but I didn't spend the time analyzing fully his whole understanding of the picture. But it was so different, very much different from mine. So in any event, I just mentioned as a point of fact that I wasn't the first to refute the documentary hypothesis. But he didn't refute it on conceptual grounds as much or as powerful as the stuff that I brought in to do it. Okay, so this was the thing where we stand. So that the history since this time, you look at the Anchor Bible and the other biblical translations and everything, and they'll tell you in the beginning that they are building on the sort of return to a modified version. They didn't just repeat Wellhausen and the German scholars who initiated the whole program, early 19th century, late 19th century, and so on. But they continue to look at the text in terms of these four schools of thought, of different versions of the text, and that is still today the dominant entry into the text.
For academics.
For the people who studied the Bible. Now you should know as an aside, where I got this idea I don't know, but I was never afraid. When I did Torah on any level, I didn't have any fear in my mind. I didn't have any stream of consciousness that said, look, you better be careful. Better watch, because the guy's bringing a linguistic point, and the guy's bringing something in history, and it looks like on the surface there's a contradiction, and you better sort of take a back seat. For some reason, I always said, what do you mean? It's part of this Darkei Noam thing. What do you mean? Hashem is going to allow falsehoods in the picture? Such that at a later, now it looks like it's true, and then at a later time, 200 years from now, it looks all false? And that's the whole thing, and nothing is said about it? Nothing is determined about that? 40 years, it takes 40 days for the Vlad, for the embryo to show indication of the sex. Not the sex, the birth. Until then, halachically, it's water. Okay, so today we know that it's not true. It's not water. But, granted, so when you will now examine, as the material came down, let's say on this particular topic, as it developed in the continuation of the tradition, in the halacha and so on, all of a sudden it will become a question and enter the Charlotte and Chuvot, and then we, as a Torah system, we'll relate to this problem. Does it change the din? Does it not change the din? And so on and so on and so on. So the point is, I felt to be afraid that I have to stop talking and take it back, and certainly don't do apologetics. Don't make up stories that get you into more trouble than you were in the first place. Okay, so this was the result. Okay, so I mentioned that they couldn't explain the Shemot 9:30 in the only other place, which is itself a puzzle, don't misunderstand. It took me 20 years of pondering that pasuk to give an answer to the question why, out of all the places in Chumash, in Dvorim, beautiful speech by Moshe Rabbeinu, beautiful psukim, in other places, beautiful psukim, why did it not say Hashem Elokim in other places other than the Gan Eden story? Why? One exception. And according to my understanding of the plagues, there was nothing special about Barad. It was the third set. There were 3 sets of 3, and Barad was in the third set, the first plague in the third set, and there was nothing special that would pull it out. First I thought there was something special. There was a thunder god in Egypt, in Mitzrayim. So if it was, Paro was seeing all this thunder, everything, he could say, well, we do that. We have a god that takes care of thunder. So, okay, so I figured, well, maybe that's right. I made it as a speculation. Maybe that's right. but maybe there's something else that's involved in the understanding of that pasuk. And so, to make the story short, I explained it in what I think was a tremendous way, that it looks the same in print. When you look at the text, it says Hashem Elokim, exactly like it says in the Gan Eden story. But I said, conceptually, it's not the two-part name, it's Hashem added to Elokim. The Chartumei Mitzrayim in the earlier part of the plagues said Etzba Elokim He. It's the finger or the hand of Elokim. As the story progresses in the plagues, Paro is more and more coming to recognize Hashem. As you look at the Psukim, you'll see that in the beginning he starts to talk. He never used the word Hashem. I didn't know him. He says, I didn't know who he was, what your God was all about, and so on. But as the Psukim develop, even though his heart is hardened, he's stubborn, he doesn't give in, nevertheless, inside those Psukim, there's a flow of a more not profuse, it wasn't so many times he used the word Hashem, but you see that there's an increase in the term Hashem, and when it came to this, Moshe Rabbeinu, who's saying that, that you have to listen to Hashem Elokim, felt the need to attribute or to get across to Paro the double name. So I said it looks the same, but conceptually it's 1 plus 1, not 2. Okay? I said it was a double name. Hashem Elokim is a double name. And here it was not a double name, it was 1 plus 1. And I explained why there was the plus. That's where it stays today. I'm open to suggestion, of course, for somebody to come and give a better explanation. Maybe it was to eliminate Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to eliminate the thunder god in Paro's mind, and he used the full power of the name. It's not mukhraf, it's not absolutely necessary. I'm still open, but it took a long time to figure out this piece. But, to come back to our point for tonight, how is the Chacham Yisrael, how is the biblical critic going to explain that? The one place where you have it. So I say that he couldn't explain it. And then there are other places where we have the same thing. Now, one of the things I thought about was, in the text, as you know, in the Chumash text, there are what's called ptuchot and stumot. If you look at a biblical text, even the printed version, there are, in the script version, there's a number of psukim and so on, and then there's a space. Typographically, there's white space, and it goes from where that word ends to the full line, and then the next line starts the next pasuk. So that's called a ptucha, open. It's an open space. It's typographical. Okay, and on the other hand, there are stumot, where the pasuk ends, and then there's a smaller space, and then on the same line in the text starts the next pasuk. That's called a stuma. So there are ptuchot and stumot in the text, and in your text, or in a printed text, they will say pay. When there's a ptucha, instead of wasting paper or trying to do the patucha, they put pay at the end of the pasuk, or you look on the Bar Ilan program, it'll give you the psukim, and then it'll say pay, ptucha, so you'll know that there was an opening here, and or stuma. So they have this thing. Now, I thought, well, wait a minute. Not too many people darshan ptuchot and stumot, but I think either the Rashbam or somebody, I forget already who, somebody did darshan ptuchot and stumot, namely to explain the thing. Now I needed a unit. I needed a definition of a unit. Otherwise, if I don't have a definition of a unit, then I can talk reasonably about Hashem and I switch to Elokim. Maybe it didn't switch. Maybe the piece ended, and I'm reading it as if it's part of this piece. It's part of a new piece. If it's part of a new piece, it could be that it's not a switch. It's a whole switch because the topic changed. But inside this particular topic, there was no switch. So I personally needed, earlier I found out when I started on that project, of explaining Hashem and Elohim, I needed a unit that closed the thing, the piece we're dealing with. Now, as you know, the numerization, the numbering of the text was contributed later by the Christian world of saying this is, Pasuk 1, Pasuk 2, and this is chapters and chapters. All that's late. And it certainly is not sufficient by any means to do something high. It's a great contribution in the sense that we could now talk and say Pasuk 1 and we all refer to the same thing. Okay. But conceptually it has no role to play. And in many places the Parsha ends for a piece for the week, and there's no Ptuchot and no Stumot, and it goes right into the next section. In other words, it's not that every Parsha begins with the last one, the last verse of the previous Parsha with a Ptucha or a Stuma. It just continues. So I needed a unit. I needed a unit of measure. So I decided the best one for me is Ptuchot and Stumot. So then I got into, that's not enough, because it's typographical. It appeals to the vision of the text, or to the auditory when you make a full stop. So in the Bereshit story, for example, each day has a Ptucha afterward. Mm-hmm. Well, it's not changing the topic. It wants to emphasize each day as a unit, each day, and so typographically, when you look at the page, your eye sees the separation of 4 items. Instead of having 4 items, you know yourself. If you want to emphasize, you put 4 items in a sentence. Okay? You get much less communication and power if you put 4 items, 1, 2, 3, 4, or with a star or something like that. If you change your text, it doesn't look nice, but sometimes you get more clout when you pin them down in a list than put them in a sentence with a comma. Okay, so use a semicolon, but still it's less. Okay, so this was the realization. Then I thought, maybe this Ptuchot and Stumot is not only for me, but for the biblical scholars who said it, that if they're having different sources, it would be very natural to separate the sources by making visual separation. When I examine that, it's true in some cases, but not true in all cases. So it's arbitrary. There's no explanation why in this case they have that, and it does match the piece, whatever they were talking about, whichever text they were involved with, the J text, the P text, whatever. But not all. It didn't have this thing. So I realized, again, that I have here a real refutation of the documentary hypothesis with examples and with this conceptual explanation. And in the beginning, when I first wrote this, I actually wrote, and I see it on the computer when I check the old version, I said I want the biblical scholars to make a public declaration of apology to Torah people, because they took us 150 years playing around with names without conclusiveness, but with power, because at least there was some explanation. And some explanation for a lot of people is better than no explanation. So, and it came down and you misled people. You guys misled people. You should apologize to real Torah people, of course. Not too many of our Torah people recognize the same points that I'm talking about. However, there was one. One is enough to say that they didn't recognize the Torah system. Okay. So here I saw that there's something wrong with this whole business of they had switches that didn't go and so forth. So until now, until this thing's come out, this refutation, the burden of exposition in relation to this unity of the text was on the Torah person. Now, after this refutation, the burden has shifted, and the burden now for explanation and clarification is on the biblical scholars. when I sent some of my writings to some of these biblical scholars, I didn't get any response, because for many, it would mean changing their whole orientation to the text.
Okay.
And I didn't check how old they were, but after 39 plus, you're not so prone to say, well, I made a mistake, I'm going to do my whole work over again. You just say, go with it, go with the momentum, especially when that's the contemporary opinion. Okay, so what you have there is, it couldn't explain the switches, it couldn't explain this business of these exceptions to the rule, and so forth. Okay, so indeed, one more word about the Ptuchot and Stumot. For me, it has served a great point of making closure and defining the unit. However, there's a Keter version on the computer, the Bar Ilan program, what they call Keter version of the text, and a traditional, what they call it? Masoretic text, okay? And there are some differences. Not a few in words, very few in words, but in Ptuchot and Stumot, there are differences. So in the Perush that I wrote on the Torah, whenever there's a difference, I mark down in a parentheses the difference. Because when I made the label, I'm going to talk about this topic, Maseh Breshit, I gave the psukim, and in front of each set of psukim I put S or P, Stuma, Ptucha, in parentheses, so the reader should see that this piece is in between two Ptuchot or without, and so on and so on. And in some cases, indeed, there's a difference between the Keter text and the Masoretic text. Most people in the scholarship world, I don't know about the Torah world, but most people in the scholarship world accept the Keter as a more valuable, more accurate text. I didn't take any stand on that. I don't know enough to take a stand on that. But I know that for a number of people, even Torah people, the Keter text, and that's the one that the Bar Ilan used. As a matter of fact, when I was writing the Perush on Megillat Esther, so I used the text, the Keter, because that gives you the program. You can, copy it over and push it in. So I used the Keter, and I found 8 places where it was different. And I'm looking at my thing I'm writing, and I'm looking at the regular copy of Megillat Esther. It's different. The words are the same, but there's... I jumped. So I wrote them a letter. And I called them up and I said, you made a mistake. Naive. I said, you made a mistake. I found 8 differences. And then the guy writes me back, we do the Keter. Well, it happened to be the case that in that Perush on Megillat Esther, 4 of those 8 places were very significant to understand the text. The fact that they had a difference or that they didn't have anything. When if they didn't have anything, that means that the psukim that are continuing, are really connected to the previous and not a separate topic. So that 4 out of the 8 places, I had to not only mention it to the reader, that I'm not a dope, I'm aware of the Keter text, but I had to do some talking, because it affected the pshat. It affected the meaning of the text. Now, that was the same thing in the Chumash. When I found differences between the Keter and the Masoretic text, in some places it affects the understanding. And indeed affects I need closure on each piece, so I can say, this is an Hashem thing, you find Hashem in 10 places in this piece, but Elokim in none. Well, that's a pretty good sign that it's an Hashem-oriented piece. Sometimes you find it, let's say, it's 6 places Hashem and 3 places Elokim. That's a little difficult. You can't say right off the bat. If there's no Elokim in the story, then it's an Hashem story. What to talk about? There could be only one. But in one place is better than nothing. If there's nothing, there's nothing. But when they're 2 together in some proportion, you have to explain, and I explain each one, so it cleans up the thing. But you can't make a general statement, this is an Hashem story, because it has in it the others. So I'm only indicating to you that for me, this whole choice of Ptuchot and Stumot has in it a number of problems, because I discovered, as I said in the Bereshit story, that sometimes it's used not to separate topics, but to emphasize by vision. I was a printer. When you look at the printed page, it tells you something. When you design a letterhead or you design material for somebody in printing, it was an art. I was pretty good at that, as a matter of fact. But anyway, this was the picture.
I had one too. Yeah.
Okay. So now, this is just about Pilchot and Sumot, about the refutation of the documented hypothesis, and now it extends into historical considerations. Because, again, we have the text, and the text coming down in these different versions, and my view is that I'm bypassing this and putting a different explanation to everything. However, inside me and inside anybody else, there are pieces that seem to fit history, especially when the more archaeology we discover, the better we get as to what's going on. However, we're very sparse to understand what the world of Moshe Rabbeinu looked like in 1500 BC. We have more information about the prophets and the temple periods, but we have very little concerning the older period, and therefore, Rabbi always brings in some of these points, very well taken. When you have one document, one historiographic entity, which is you have to have evidence, it's not enough to establish anything about what was going on. If we had anthropology people, if we had a continuation of that in some form, in some kind of an anthropological content where we could go in as anthropologists, we'd get a little more. Like in some cases even today. We can examine some tribe that's still operative in Africa, but it's carrying on traditions from an earlier period, and we can glean something about the earlier situation from the contemporary archaeology. Okay, as you know, I don't have to tell you that. Everybody understands the more archaeology we have, the more we have another entry, another stream. But indeed, it's very sparse and very difficult to make conclusions, affirmative conclusions about what was going on. So, I put down a few examples. First, there was the crossing of the Red Sea, of Yam Suf. What it referred to is another story. Machloket, it referred to the Red Sea, the Dead Sea. It referred to a body of water that turned red because of algae. And there were different understandings. But there was one guy, Velikovsky, in the 40s, who wrote a book called Worlds in Collision and a number of other pieces, Ages in Chaos, where he explained the crossing of the Bnei Israel going into the sea and crossing the sea and so on and so on. I remember a friend of mine called me up, the whole night, didn't sleep. I went right through the book in one night, because look, to get an explanation of what the wall of the water stood up and on the right and on the left and so on. I mean, obviously it's in a poetic kind of a form, However, something happened in the story. Something happened. Never mind whether it really happened in history. That's a deeper question. But in the text, there was something that happened. There's an event that happened, and it was described. So how do we explain the description? So Velikovsky came out that a comet had hit the Earth and changed the axis of the Earth axis and affected the planet per se. And he did cross-cultural study assuming that was true, this astronomical piece, and he did a cross-cultural study, and he showed that in many of the cultures you have the same type of a story. Okay, great. I didn't sleep, but it was worth no sleep, because at least you come out with something that made a little sense. Of course, as we went on, it didn't hold up. There was not enough evidence to show that the comet did hit the planet, and so on. And then at the later stage, he wrote a book called Amnesia, something like that. And it's later, after he finished these books, and he sort of indicated, or intimated, shall I say, intimated over there that he was making a kind of an experiment for Western civilization about how they could believe a whole package that he presented, and he was making an experiment. It really wasn't true. Okay.
That's what Velikovsky said?
Well, he didn't use those words. That's what I said. He didn't say it wasn't true, but he said, in effect, it's an experiment. Now, this is not, it sounds to me, say, look, why'd you fake us out? But there are things like that. There was a book called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain by Lynn and Schroeder, two women. And it was a big book, big prize and everything, and it talked about sharpening blades and pyramid and so on, a lot of things in the whole tradition. Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. And you probably know better than me. What I heard through the grapevine was that in Soviet Union, anybody who had abilities in psychic things, telekinesis and other things like that, were taken by force to Moscow and to be put and used in the research that was going on at the time. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. I never examined it, but I take it as true. But to make the point I'm making now, Lynn and Schroeder wrote a book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. And after it won the prize and it got money and they made a fortune, they said, this is false. We never had anything like it. We're just putting it out as the same way to see the gullibility and the need of Western-sized people to get some kind of an explanation that was obvious. So it wasn't crazy. I mean, here were Lynn and Schroeder, two authors, and they said, look, we just made an experiment to check gullibility, but it didn't happen. So it was real. Now, of course, there were surrounding factors that everybody knew who was following the field, that Soviet Union was working on psychic material to try to get more insight into the mind and so on, and perhaps weapons and whatever it is. So anyway, this is the thing.
Sounds like a bit like a program for the Cold War,
Oh,
it sounds
for
to
sure, it could have been. So I didn't investigate the whole system, but I did find out that, and it was the case. And I told my students when I used it that it's only this story. This is it. Take it with a grain of salt. Don't eat salt. Take it with a grain of don't eat sugar. Anyway, salt and sugar. The food doesn't taste good. What can I tell you? Linda's a great cook, so now I'm living on salt-free and sugar-free. Okay, Baruch Hashem de Shabbat. So you can cheat a little bit. Okay, good. So this is the Velikovsky story. Anybody who was interested in Torah took the night. He didn't take one night, he took 2 nights, and he finished the book. Because that, at least we got some. Okay. About, I'd say, that was 1950. I guess about 50 years later, because it happened in Israel. I'm here in Israel since 1971. So in 72, something like that, I was in the library in Givat Ram, and I was looking for a book on the shelf. You can go down to the stacks. And my eye caught a book from the Royal Society in England, Royal Society, that said something about the expertise of Moses, something like that. Wait, so of course, the hell with what I was looking for. I forgot what I went down there for. And I took that book off the shelf and I took it out. Went upstairs and I checked it out. Well, there was a guy named Dawson who was a member of the Royal Society, and he wrote a book that based on the contemporary archaeology of the time, which is 1930, 1920, something like this. And he wrote a book in which part of it was in the title, because I wouldn't have caught it. It was Moses in the title, called The Military Expertise of Moses. About a 150-page piece on what happened at Kriyas Yamsuf. Well, how we're supposed to enter that text. How we're supposed to enter the text. Well, before I even read it, I said, wow, wait a minute, that's great. It's going to... At that time already, there was a lot of material against Velikovsky, and it was pretty tough to hold it as your explanation package. you had to do a lot of talking because there was a lot of opposition by that time. There were conferences on Velikovsky, and there was reputation from the astronomy people, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, and then they examined his cross-cultural stuff, and so it wasn't we weren't that easy that you can say, well, I got the explanation, you go on or write a Perush, and in the Perush say, use that, and that's the end. Well, military expertise of Moses. What was the military expertise? Well, first of all, the text says they came up armed, chalushim. So they went out, in one word, indicating they were ready for a fight. Okay? So what was the thing? They went out in such a way, under the leadership of Moshe, such that there was high mountains on one side, the midbar on the other side, and the water in front, such that any opposition, any fighting force could not outflank them. Outflanking, as you know in military history, was one of the fundamental pieces in military logistics to ensure that the enemy could not come around you from the back. And I was a Lone Ranger man, Tonto Lone Ranger, and in every program, no television, but on the radio, I visualized, the whole picture. And this is the thing. Oh, the Indians are coming, but they're coming from the round side, and they make the thing, So here was a piece, the military, 120, 130-page piece, the military expertise of Moses.
It sounds like if Moses was like brought up in the royal courts of Egypt, that he should have been like a...
Yeah, okay, but I never heard that before. Yeah. It said chalushim, I knew the word.
Chamushim.
Chamushim, right. Chamushim, from 50, Chamushim. I think it has a,
Rashi says it's armed.
That the size of the unit, I think, was chamishim. But anyway, but anyway, it was this, and this thing accounted. And then he said, further, okay, he was there. He was at the place where this thing took place. And lo and behold, he discovered a number of geographical facts. That sometimes the wind comes in and bounces off the mountains and makes the water such that you could wade across. It wasn't deep like in the sea in the Mediterranean in the first place, but it was enough that you couldn't just go in. But at certain times and in certain conditions, this triad, the midbar on the one side and the high mountains on the other side, which Moshe took as military logistics, had a function that manifested itself in the story. That it couldn't reasonably be said in a poetic way that the water stood on end and waded up. I use the example of a cascade. What's the thing? Well, my old Chevy, 57 Chevy, when I brought it in for work, well, this was an antique. I still in Israel, it's an antique, and so on. And I use the example, well, all the cars dance off the road. They just dance by themselves off the lift. And my car, 57 Chevy, with the fins, would just roll right in, go right on the top. I would make way, and I would be the only one in the shop, and they would work on my car. Or a dignitary that's coming to a lecture, gets out of the car, and here are the people, random, and all of a sudden, as he's starting to walk, make way, you have a beautiful geometric cascade, where you can see it on TV. I mean, you see that. So this was my example, analogous to what was going on. There was something going on that affected by the wind and the geography of the place, such that it's reasonable to say it was something like a cascade or something like the wall standing up that made sense out of this. So this was an alternative explanation, which until today still makes more sense to me than the Velikovsky picture. So, to come back. So there are the biblical text, the unity of the text here is coming from, that's our topic for tonight. Now, the unity of the Torah Chumash text is coming from this whole package of ideas that I've been throwing out for tonight. It gives you a unity and a unification and a organization of the text in terms of these things. It's not sufficient, there are other things, but this is certainly a big, big part of it. To give you one further illustration that's so fresh in my mind, because I'm redoing the Shemot story, and I'm on the Egel HaZohav, and Panim Hashem talks to Moshe, Panim, and so on. What I discovered was, in going over it, I had it then, when I wrote it originally, it's 15, 20 years ago, and I have it now. I rewrote it in a richer way. This whole idea of Moshe Rabbeinu talking Panim el Panim, face to face, like a friend to his friend, like a person to his friend. That's the text. What's that all about? What is it? Just means that it's like intimate, because the story. If you read the story, you see the beauty. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. The usual formulation is Vaydaber Moshe El Hashem, or Vaydaber Hashem El Moshe when they have a conversation, or Vayomer. Okay, we're not going to talk about those two, but that's the usual form, the formality, a standard version. Vayomer Hashem, or Vaydaber Hashem, or Vayomer Moshe. Now over here, there's a dialogue between Hashem and HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Moshe, and you see from the text they went out of the formula. Instead of saying Vayomer or Vaydaber Moshe El Hashem, it says Diber. Diber Moshe El Hashem. And the other way around, it says Diber Hashem El Moshe. In other words, the text, in the choice of words, going out of the formalism of Vaydaber Hashem El Moshe and vice versa, was trying to communicate to the reader the intimacy dimension of the story. The music of the story is that there's an intimacy here. And then, of course, as you know, Moshe Rabbeinu asked, what's your ways? What's your kavod? Who are you? What's it all about? Why am I listening to you? Why am I involved with Hashem and blah, 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 whole story. So, that in the psukim, the music is of intimacy as reflected in the change of these locutions. You see? But to give you one gem that what's it all about? What do you mean Panim el Panim? So if you look at the text, Panim el Panim is conversation. When you talk to somebody, you talk to the person. Okay? So Panim el Panim to me rang a bell of conversation. Conversation is the paradigm for the organization of the entire text. The model of the text is all these shifts from Hashem to Elohim and vice versa are modeled on or organized from, shall we say, the notion of conversation. What happens in conversation? Well, we start, so one person starts, I'm talking to you face to face, I'm now relating a story. Facts. Okay, 5 minutes later, you talk, or I continue talking, and I'm now justifying the fact. I'm getting into reasons why it was done. First I'm saying I went to the movies. Then I'm saying why I went to the movies. Well, it turns out that one of the key meanings of the difference between Hashem and Elohim is just this. When the text wants to report the fact with no indication of explanation, it will always say Hashem. When the text wants to explain something, to justify something, shall we say, not to explain, to justify something, give the reasons why, or in the story there's an injustice implicit in the story, then it will say Elohim. And I proved it by, as you go through the Perush, and you look at where it says Elohim. So in the midwives of Paro, it's an Elohim dimension, because there was a basic injustice, operative, and so on. Whatever it is. But the point was that this is inside the text. So I discovered, and I rewrote it now, yesterday, to make it more powerful, that the organization of the text is based on ordinary conversation, where in split-second time it shifts. First we're in praise, somebody's doing a praising, then somebody's doing blaming, then somebody's giving advice, then somebody's not taking the advice, and then there's fact and justification of the fact, and so forth. When you look at these things, that is what is organizing the text. Because all these slices of experience that the text is reporting on is being carried by the two names and the switches. So when there's a switch, there's a reason, but it's built, the model is built on ordinary conversation, which I thought was a very significant point, and as you work it out, you see that it's the case. And in this, here was an example of the intimacy. So they did it that way, and they added to the intimacy by changing the formula. Instead of using the standard text, it jumps out at you when it says Omar, or Diber Moshe, or Vayomer. Vayomer, he said, who? Doesn't say who, it just says Vayomer. But if you read the text, it's understood that this is Moshe talking. Because 3 psukim before, it was Moshe talking. And then there was Hashem answered, and then Moshe came again. So it said Vayomer. Now it wasn't stylistic. It wasn't style. That wasn't the reason to save words. I mean, it will make us repeat the thing. It repeated 100 times, 200 times by Daber Hashem al Moshe. When it wants to say, bingo, Vaydav Hashem al Moshe, it says Vaydav Hashem al Moshe, and that's the end of the story. It doesn't mince words for aesthetic point, but it can change the order of the words to carry the music of the psukim, of the material. Okay, so you have this as an example. Okay, so you have this illustration of the inside the making of the Egel HaZahav, of the golden calf. You have this intimacy, and Panim El Panim, which is one of the psukim that it brings down, that Hashem talked to Moshe. Panim El Panim has another dimension to it, to provide the reader with a big principle, which is organization of the text, how it's organized. It reminds me, it reminds me when I was at the University of Chicago, they had courses in the philosophy department. It was organization, methods, and principles. One, instead of 101, the famous jokes, they had organization, OMP1, OMP2, OMP3, OMP4. In other words, organization, methods, and principles. What was this all about? They were doing the great books, and they were teaching the student how to read the great books in the different domains. So if you were a history major, you took OMP1 in the history department. And if you were a philosophy major, you took OMP1 in the philosophy department. So each field, they had selected sources, they printed their own textbooks, you had selections, and that was the curriculum. That was the curriculum, but it was based on organization, method, and principle. So that from the organization of a text, how it's organized, you get, as logically implied or reasonably implied, methodology of how to read the text, and with the methodology you relate to the principles which are operative in the whole text. And that was University of Chicago. Until today, I still have some of the books. When I got to Harvard, they said philosophy begins with Bertrand Russell. I said, I just came to the University of Chicago. What do you mean philosophy begins with Bertrand Russell? Well, what about Spinoza? What about Leibniz? What about... The goal was how to understand the philosopher. So they said, this is Harvard, you have to have a critique. I took a Spinoza course, the professor gives me A minus, minus, minus. I go over at the end, I said, look, I'm not a grade complainer, but what does that mean? Well, he said, the exposition that you gave on Spinoza was A. Great. But there's no critical section. I looked at him, my eyes went crazy, I said, critical section? Who am I to make a critique of Spinoza? I don't know enough to make a critique of Spinoza. So he said, well, this is Harvard. At Harvard, we do things, philosophy begins with Bertrand Russell, and President Eliot said, who was the former president of Harvard, there's a Harvard man on the wrong side of every question. And that was the motto, and it's still with me today, because what happened as time developed, I became exemplary of exactly that. There's a guy at the wrong side of every question. Everybody's saying one thing, you're saying something else. Like Luther got up and said, I stand alone. Okay. But anyway, this was the so the whole idea of giving you something in the text, hidden, as you would say, right in this story, as an organization, as a principle of organization, is a big point, because it relates to the whole text, and I exemplified it in the text, and indeed, it leads to methodology. It leads to methodology, and I made the point that the text is different from other texts, because intrinsically it's dialogical, like conversation. Where's the dialogue? The dialogue is between the text and the reader. In other words, the text, because we're in the same world, the reader who has input of cognition and feelings and sensitivities, those can be reflected off and bounce off what Moshe Rabbeinu has in the story. So that the reader, in a certain way, is part of the text. Because the model is conversation. So when the reader gets a stream of consciousness, when he's reading the pasuk, well, that's like as if the pasuk is part of a conversation and jumped out at you, and the guy had a stream of consciousness. He was just going to say that, but, well, the text took over. So that is the text is not the way we usually look at a text. It's dialogical, not monological, and it affects the methodology. And so you have the methodology coming out of the organization, and then with that goes how it coheres with the principles. So it exemplified this whole picture. Okay, organization. So I found it beautiful exemplification of that right there in the piece that I was redoing yesterday about the panim el panim. Why does it say that? Why is it talking about? And so on and so on. And then there's a contradiction. You can only see my back. We don't talk. If somebody walks away from you or holds their back to you, you don't have a conversation. You walk away and so on. So then you have to explain what that is, what that's all about, and so on and so on. But the model, the paradigm, is panim el panim, like a friend to another. And then when I talked to the Perush about friendship, what that means, what that doesn't mean, what does that mean? It's not, I differentiated from Davek Leishto, that in the man-wife relation, that's a different thing. That's not friendship. That's a different plane of analysis and understanding. And all these things in the Chumash are very worthy of inquiry. Not to take for granted the words and the description, but to parallel them off and make the analogies and so forth. And in the Perush, instead of doing something that I couldn't do, I don't know enough to do, of citing Midrash and so forth, I use the contemporary tool to give you parallel psukim. So if it says Avas Elokim, I say, well, after I finish the explanation in the context, I then take a paragraph and say, there are 5 places in Torat Moshe where it says Avas Elokim, and they are this and this and this. Or there's no place where it says Avas Elokim, it always says Avas Hashem, and I explain why. So right on the spot, for the reader, are hooked on things that I do with the tool, where I could memorize the text to be able to give you all that. Well, with a tool like this, you press a button and I can tell you all the places. Of course, I forget them the minute I burn them down, but you know, I write them down. Sometimes I take a printout and I have a list, and there's 25, let's say, in Chumash. So I take each one, and from each one, the context of each one, I get and I build up the family of meanings underneath each of the terms. When it says Ava, there's 100 million times of Ava. Ava in what frame? In what sense? What are we talking about? So we have a dictionary. Use a dictionary. Dictionary gives you a couple of usages, that's it. But in detail, in reality, shall we say, the concreta, there's psychological concreta, sexual concreta, bodily concreta, all dimensions which are infused in what I call the family resemblance of words under the word Ava, Yiraat, and go down to every word in Chumash. So there are subtleties and concreta and added information when you don't just read the word and just leave your definition out and don't, or just take your own, but you don't milk the material for all these nuances. When you do, just by a simple tool like that, when I look up in there 15 places where it says Vayered Hashem, God came down. It never says Vayered Elokim. Why not? In other words, when you go that way and you ask the question, and you have 15 pieces to ask, after a while you get a nice paragraph of usages, which is giving the reader the music and the feel for the text. So here was a simple little thing, and it operates like that. Okay, so we talked about that. We talked about the thing. So another example is the man in the midbar. Again, the jump was always, what are we talking about? What is it? And so it was some kind of a carbohydrate from the text, because it was made into some kind of a dough that could be used and so on. But what do you mean? I mean, the story is exemplifying the significance of the Shabbat, that you don't work on the Shabbat and the Mishkan stopped working for the Shabbat. That's the context of the story. But what exactly it was? That was the tendency to ask the question and to try to give an answer. There were two Englishmen, engineers, who wrote a piece on, I forget the two names, I have it here somewhere, a book, two engineers who wrote a piece on, they had like a machine, some kind of a machine that processed this, whatever it was, man, and made it edible. Okay, and then they tied it up with Kabbalah and so on. Okay, it's a speculation. But again, unless you have the anthropology, unless you have the archaeology material, we're left with speculations. It could be myth, legamre. It could be, the same Avi brought one once about, there's no mention in Egyptian history about the Exodus. So it could be pure myth, that it never happened. But, whether it be myth or history, there was reality somewhere. I mean, the whole book is not fiction. There are references to historical things. But what they are and how they fit is a tremendous job of bobbing and weaving to try to use the material and try to get conclusions, of which we don't have much. So we have the constructions, and we have to be satisfied with what we have. If we'll find more, that'll be helpful. Kol hakavod. I mentioned an example of archaeology in the Queen Esther Perush. They found Albright, who was a big archaeology man. They found a can, which they thought was an incense can from the temple. It turned out to be a perfume can. That women had a can that perfumed them in the text, in the story. And Esther didn't need that. She was Malka v'Kodesh Baruch Hu. But the point was, it would turn out to be a perfuming can which could radiate 300 feet. That's a ballpark. So a woman who's sitting over here with perfume, when you're sitting right there, you gotta have the bows on. What are you gonna do? But if the woman is 300 feet away, and you still have the smell, that's indicative of the process of cosmetic in Persia and so on, so on, so on. That you had all of this. Okay, so the more archaeology, the better. But still, it's not sufficient. So it could be myth, could be history, and each one of these things deserves explanation. However, aside from what it is, there are these other, when you put it in the organizational frame that I talk about, with all of this material, you do gain insight into what it was. If there were more places, if there were 30 places where it said the man, well, then we'd be much better, because we would pick up from the methodology here more facts of the concrete that we could come to a better picture. But, of course, without closure. When you have one or two places where it's mentioned, well, you can't do much. I mentioned in passing once about the dress of Queen of Sheba, where some guy was giving a lecture and he said he got stuck on the words in the text, Malachim, what it was, and he got stuck on her dress. What did she look like? What was her dress? How did she dress? And so on, so on, so on. So I made an analysis for him, and I gave him a present for giving the course. I enjoyed it and everything. I made the thing, I gave him. He never looked at it. He lost it and this and that. He never got it. I said, well, if it was so important to you, you should have looked at it. But anyway, he didn't look at it. But the point is, I darshan the one-time words. The one-time words. What do you do with one-time words? So you have to have a linguistic technique to do something, but indeed, it would be nice if they had 15 places where they describe what she looked like. So then with this model that I'm presenting, we would have more information, and maybe he wouldn't have gotten so stuck. He was relying on the words, and you have one-time words, we're stuck on the basic thing. Okay, so it relates, what I'm pointing out now is that how the alternative that I worked out, that I discovered, which on the one hand put the burden of exposition on the documentary hypothesis, has taken on, as I began to work with it for 10, 15 years, has taken on a fantastic range of material that I could write about and explain and get across to the reader that's coming from this beginning point in the Sukkot story of Darkei Noam, that everything has to be in principle, explainable, reasonable, not loading the mind with things that are unknowable, or more loading the mind with things that are not true. We could put in the mind things that are not true, but have meaning. That's another world. So there's value to myth, and there's value to things that may not be true, and the word indeed is value. In the 20th century, philosophy itself shifted from truth to value. If you look at the texts, at the books that I sell and everything else, and you see there was Ogden and Rich's meaning of meaning. That was, we went to school, Larry, everybody went. Now, Ogden and Rich's was the book you had to read. It was a must reading for everybody. The meaning of meaning, we're talking about value. We're talking about worth. We're talking about function. We're not talking about existence. So the shift has shifted. And indeed, like Whitehead said, everything in philosophy is a footnote to Plato, and so it never dies, and the whole concern with existence, being, and so forth remains in the philosophical world. I myself, as you know, I have graduated out into a more contemporary orientation, built on language, built on the performative, built on meaning, on value, on worth. Okay, but it's still there. It's not just disbanded. There are some attempts. There was an attempt in Heidegger. There was an attempt in Levinson to restore some more of the classical picture than we have taken for. Okay, I'm not going to talk about Peirce, but the same thing happened. Okay. Seder. That covers more or less what I want to talk about tonight. The point was to try to show you and talk about what was underneath all of this, the unity of the Torat Moshe text. And what are the elements that are going into that unity such that we have a real significant alternative for the first time. A real comprehensive and significant alternative to the documentary hypothesis. And that was the point of tonight's talk, to try to get across, at least in form, without every example, all these examples. It's very up in the air how to explain why one piece, one chapter or one section is Elokim, another section is Hashem, some sections are both. It switches from Hashem to Elokim or vice versa, and some sections have neither. Like in the story of Yosef, the first chapter, 38 or whatever the first chapter is, in the Yosef story, it's a whole parak, and there's neither. So, again, it didn't follow the pattern. So I took upon myself to try to study this and try to understand what this is all about. As time went on, I realized, when I looked at the Meforshim, that everybody says something about Hashem and Elokim. The famous Chazal that everybody knows is that Hashem is Rachmim and Elokim is Din. And then they go on. But there was nobody, none of the Meforshim, who took the time to discuss or answer every question, every place where it says Hashem and every place where it says Elokim, to say something that answers the question, why and not the other way. Now, it's not taking it for granted. Everybody took it for granted. It gave you pshat about din and rachmim, but nobody took the trouble to comment on each one. Now, in the text, there's about 1,800 places in the Chumash. Not Nach. In the Chumash, there's 1,800 places or so where it says Hashem, and about 250 places where it says Elokim. Okay, it also says Elohim Acherim, but when you look at a general ballpark thing in Torah that relates to the understanding, to the feelings, to the action, but especially to the understanding, the frame that I was in, must be exemplary of the Darchei Noam principle. In other words, Hashem won't give unknowables, paradox that can't be solved, where the mind is left up in the air. There's closure on each of the topics. Could be incomplete, could be missing things, but there's relative closure on different things so that the mind is in a pleasant state. The mind is in an unpleasant state when it's fed too much belief without evidence for truth, and so the mind regurgitates. It's not in the pleasant mode. So yours truly generalized, I should say, this principle, and it became the fundamental orientation, and indeed it's the name of all the work that I do in Torah. All my Torah writings are called Darchei Noam, from this story. Okay. Now, one of the things that struck me was that I always had difficulty with the text, the Chumash biblical Torat Moshe text, with these names of Hashem and Elokim, the two primary names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I don't know, one day it hit me so strong that my mind isn't at rest. I was figure it's 250 places. So I embarked on a project to do what nobody did. It was left little things for little guys. And where do I come off to make a perush? What am I going to do? I'm going to duplicate Rashi. I'm going to duplicate the Malvim. My knowledge of the Gemara and Chazal and Agaritas was not enough to imitate Rashi and bring in Midrash and so forth. So, okay, well, but it was left for a little guy, a big guy with a little guy. What am I going to tell you? So what turned out was this understanding of each one of the entries. So on each one of the 1,800 places where it says Hashem, even it says Vaydaber Hashem El Moshe, which is a standard refrain in the text, or Vayomer, but most of the time Vaydaber. And there's a whole discussion of Vaydaber and Vayomer and all the meanings, what that was all about, because that's another one that hit me so strong. Sometimes it's Vayomer Hashem, and sometimes it's Vaydaber Hashem. And then it switches. And two psukim later, it goes back. So these switches related to the names intrigued me, and I began to work on that topic. Okay, but being me, I was familiar with the documentary hypothesis, which we'll talk about tonight, in terms of the unity of the text. In other words, there was a standard opinion in the biblical scholarship world for 150 years that there were different sources that eventually made up the Chumash text, and they were labeled, or they were differentiated, shall we say, by the use of the term Hashem or Elokim, or Hashem Elokim, and no, there were four versions, and each one had in it, was defined by the presence of Hashem and vice versa. Okay. Well, when I looked at what I did and what they did, they're making a lot of fudge. I'm explaining in conceptual terms why it says Hashem and why it says Elohim. Not on language, but on concept. The explanation was in terms of a rational picture. You can disagree, but that's what I did. Whereas here we're having the Chacham Yisrael tradition, the biblical tradition, which is building not on reason, but on authoritative pieces. I mean, here was an authoritative piece that it came down somehow to whoever redacted it, Ezra or whoever you want to say. But the point was, these things had reasonable veracity. They weren't making things up out of the clouds. But when I looked at it, I began to realize that I got something great. And when I first wrote this whole orientation in the beginning, it's 15, 20 years ago, and I realized, wait a minute, I got the first rational refutation of the biblical people. In other words, there was no rational refutation. We as Torah people put an emphasis on Chumash, on Psukim, and Torah Shabbat, and so on. The whole, it's essential, it's intrinsic to our whole understanding of Torah. So we didn't know what to say. We said, look, we don't buy that. We don't believe that. Our belief in Torah is a principle. Chag HaSukkot is 4.5 months away. So we'll start with Chag HaSukkot.
Good idea.
Now, on Chag HaSukkot, everybody knows, we have a lulav and an esrog. And that's part of the mitzvah to be performed on Sukkot. Now, in the Gemara, they were struggling with the problem. One of the problems they had was to determine what exactly a lulav was. Okay? They didn't know which plant it was. And so they had this question in the Gemara about what a lulav is. And they have, as traditional, they have different opinions and viewpoints. And somebody comes up with a reason. And his reason was that all Hashem's ways are darchei noam, are pleasant. Therefore, the plant that they were discussing was a plant that if you held it in your hand and you shook it, you would have bleeding on your hand because it had thorns and roughage on the place where you hold it. So this guy brings up pasuk, and he says, that's my argument. No reason, no exposition. He brings a pasuk, he says, God's ways, Hashem's ways are darchei noam, are ways of pleasantness. Therefore, to have a mitzvah and then go away with a bloody hand was not compatible with the pasuk.
Right.
When I heard that at a shir, I flipped out. Because what did I do? I generalized that point to say the following, that every